Nigeria, uplifting the people and uniting the nation.
It's 10 o'clock and this is the network service of Radio Nigeria. Good morning, listener. Welcome to another edition of Electoral Reform Hour on the network service of Radio Nigeria, your platform for thoughtful conversations on building a stronger, more credible electoral system in Nigeria. Last week, we explored the topic of affirmative action and electoral reform with Brenda Anugon, the CEO of the Nigerian Women Trust Fund. We examined the ongoing debate around quotas and the broader quest for greater political representation of women in Nigeria. But democracy is a complex puzzle and the pieces are many. This week, we shift gears to the bigger picture, comprehensive electoral reforms in Nigeria. With elections in the horizon, the call for reforms is louder than ever. What bold changes can rebuild or increase trust? How can institutions be strengthened to safeguard the people's mandate? My name is Ezenwawa. Stay with us as we unpack these critical reforms. Electoral Reform Hour is a program aimed to foster inclusive dialogue among citizens from varied backgrounds concerning electoral reform and constitutional amendments, enhance public understanding and awareness regarding electoral reforms, and possibly compile and present citizen-derived recommendations to the National Assembly and the Independent National Electoral Commission for consideration. This program is brought to you by Peering Advocacy and Advancement Center in Africa, PAACA, with support from MacArthur Foundation. As Nigeria inches towards another election cycle, the momentum for transformative electoral reform is gaining ground. From proposals for mandatory voting to the establishment of a dedicated Electoral Offences Commission, the reform landscape is brimming with ideas that could reshape how Nigerians experience and engage with democracy. Yet, beneath these proposals lie deeper questions. Can the state promote participation without encroaching on personal freedoms? Will holding an election, all elections on a single day enhance efficiency or strain the system? How can institutions built to enforce accountability remain insulated from political capture? These debates strike at the heart of Nigeria's electoral credibility, where persistent issues like vote buying, low turnout, and systemic manipulation continue to undermine public trust. The road to meaningful reform demands more than bold legislation. It requires strong institutions, inclusive frameworks for participation, and the courage to reimagine how elections serve the people. That's the focus of today's conversation on Electoral Reform Hour, as we unpack the big ideas and pressing proposals shaping Nigeria's path to more credible and inclusive democratic process. Joining us is Samson Itodo, Executive Director of Yiaga Africa, with over a decade of experience in governance reform, electoral governance, and civic engagement. He is also the principal partner of the Electoral Law Center and the convener of the Not Too Young to Run movement. Itodo's background in law and his commitment to strengthening democratic institutions make him a leading voice in promoting people-centered legislation and active citizenship. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Sam.
Thank you very much for having me. I used to be the convener of the Not Too Young to Run movement, so not.
No, I said that. Yes. Now that's in the past. You are founding convener. That's fine. Now it is the bill has been passed.
Yeah.
It is now the age reduction
bill. Yeah.
Act. Also, yes, act. Yeah?
Yes.
So let's cut the chase. Over the past few years, few months, the National Assembly has introduced or fast-track several bills. From a bird's eye view, how do you see these initiatives coalescing to a broader reform agenda?
Well, I think that the role that the National Assembly plays in trying to reform our laws ahead of the next election is strategic and it's important. The National Assembly is performing its role. That's what it should do. It's there to make laws. The big question is, when you're making laws, there are three questions you ask yourself. The first one is there a gap in the current law that you want to fix? The second one, is there a mischief in the existing law that you want to address? And thirdly, it's whether you need appropriation, to address a particular issue within our context. And so one will ask, are there gaps in our electoral system? Yes, there are gaps in our electoral system. I think a constellation of all the issues that have been articulated by the National Assembly, if implemented, will strengthen our electoral process. But I just want to maintain that with the current Electoral Act, we can still have better elections. However, there are certain ambiguities within the law that needs to be fixed, and the National Assembly needs to prioritize those, and we can go into some of those issues. But I think broadly, there are 5 things that we think, if the National Assembly prioritizes, it will enhance the integrity of the next elections. The first big one deals with the independence of INEC. How do you strengthen INEC's independence? And we've had this discussion for over 17 years since Justice Uwe's committee submitted its report. That is a great need to strengthen INEC's independence by ensuring that the appointing authority is not the president, but it is vested, in another institution that enjoys multi-stakeholder representation. So remove that power from the president. The good thing with this reform process, perhaps even for the first time, INEC has now also adopted that same recommendation, because INEC is now asking the National Assembly to do what? To amend the Constitution to remove the power of appointing resident electoral commissioners and vest them with INEC, so INEC can appoint what you call state directors of elections. So INEC independence is really critical. The second critical reform, it's about electronic transmission of results. And that citizens are asking that if the Supreme Court says that IREV is not part of the collation process, can we amend our laws to integrate electronic transmission and collation, not as a replacement for the manual process, but that both the electronic and the manual process go hand in hand so they can all serve as a check on each other. The third big sort of reform, again, which aligns with what citizens are demanding and what INEC is also proposing, is the need to admit any official form of identification for voter verification. In other words, the saying that no PVC, no vote is now obsolete. For one reason, that the BVAS has the voters register, and the BVAS in all the elections has functioned optimally. So if people show up at the polling unit on election day and their name is on the BVAS, if they don't have the PVC, why shouldn't they be allowed to vote? Especially in instances where the inability to present a PVC, it's not as a result of voters' failure to collect their PVCs, but because of logistical challenges on the part of INEC or the delay in producing those permanent voters' cards. So can we open up the process in a way that allows, if you have your national identity card, if you have your driver's license, if you have your international passport or any other legally recognized identification, on the day of elections, show up, tender your ID. If your name is on the voters register, you'll be allowed to vote. So that's the sort of third amendment. Interestingly, INEC also adopts this recommendation, and it's also proposing that we should even take it a step higher, that electronically downloadable voters card from INEC's website should also be admissible, and you can use that to vote on elections. I think the fourth one is about what openings are there within our processes that allow other actors that have not been voting since 1999 cast their vote. Journalists on election day don't vote. And the reason why they don't vote...
Journalists on duty.
Yes, journalists on duty. And for the most part, they're journalists, at least a large percentage of journalists who are on duty on election day, who are covering elections. Security agents don't also vote at elections.
On duty as well.
Yeah. INEC officials also don't vote on elections. Accredited observers don't vote on election day. These are Nigerians who have rights. And so the introduction of early voting will assist these people in casting their votes. And good a thing that the National Assembly is considering this, because if you look at diaspora voting, look at early voting, look at prisoners voting, when you put all of this together, what we'll be doing as a country is protecting the voting rights of these individuals.
Well, I think more importantly is expanding the democratic space to draw in more people to participate. But we have 93 million people on our voters roll as we speak. And then over a period of time, we've had between 22, 26, 28 participation at general elections. So, and then we're now talking about no PVC, no voting. Do you want to associate that to why you have that number, this admissible number of people voting? And then you still have voters' cards lying in the Independent National Electoral Commission, uncollected.
Yeah.
So sometimes I get this idea that we want to solve a problem that does not exist, really.
Well, I think the problem does exist in terms of the level of people showing up to cast their votes. Yes. And there are different dimensions to this discussion. The first dimension to this discussion is, can we really say that voters are not voting, Nigerians are not voting on elections because of the issue with our voters register and whether we are indeed 93 million people on our register? We know for a fact, and Yiaga Africa has audited the voters register and has done incredible amount of work on this, that there are, dead persons on our register. There are, or perhaps duplications on our voters register. There are unqualified persons who are on our voters register. And even if you extrapolate and do your estimation and say, okay, plus or minus, of these 93 million, let's say 30 million, out of again, this is just hypothetical. Let's say 30 million people shouldn't be on the voters register. So what you have is 63 million. Even at 63 million, the turnout for elections is still very, very poor. And so the big question is, why are people, perhaps not showing up? There are several factors. One is about the quality of governance and whether people are getting benefits for their participation in the elections. And if people lose faith, in governance, they see no reason why they should come out to cast their vote. The other issue is related to trust. To what extent? What's the level of trust that citizens have in the electoral process that their votes, will count? And then also the fact that voters need to understand the consequence of not voting, because it comes to the state at a huge cost. And so if you look at the general elections, 27% of people showed up to cast their vote. About 63% of voters didn't show up to cast their vote. That's over 60 million people who didn't come. Those 60 million people, there were 5 ballot papers for each of them that was produced. And so when you look at the calculation, the country actually wasted taxpayers' money to the tunes of hundreds of millions that would have been used for healthcare, for education, and also fixing our infrastructure. So there's a cost for not coming out to cast. So
that leads us to perhaps the reason for the Speaker, Right Honorable Tajuddin Abbas, proposing this bill on compulsory voting. And I know that proponents argue it will drastically boost turnout and deepen civic engagement. Critics, maybe like us, among them constitutional lawyers like you, counter the force that forcing citizens to vote could infringe on individual freedom. What's your reading of the trade-offs between duty and liberty in this context?
In fact, the fact that you use the word force, it's it's just evident that this shouldn't even stand in the first place, because you cannot coerce, participation. And I think that Nigerians need to understand that the reason why both you and I and we all oppose this, it's not like we are opposed to the rationale of the bill. We're not opposed to the rationale of the bill, because what the bill seeks to do, the compulsory voting bill, is to address the question of low turnout. So it's a plausible reason. What we are opposed to,
on the face of it,
yes, what we are opposed to is the approach and the proposal. That one, you cannot compel people to cast their vote, because not participating, not voting is a form of participation. Democracy is about freedom. You'll be assaulting a constitutional right. There is a reason why voluntary participation, is at the heart of democracy, because that's what guarantees the purity of choice, that people make. Secondly, it won't solve the problem. Because when you compel or coerce people to cast their vote, coerced outcomes cannot have any form of legitimacy. So these are the fundamental issues. We don't think that this will address the problem. There are other priorities that the National Assembly need to focus on.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And
but
then,
they are citing that about 25 countries have adopted this compulsory voting.
Yeah.
There's that comparison always, drawing from Australia and the rest of them. So do you think that comparison is necessary in the context of the challenges of building democracy that we are currently undergoing?
No, I see. I've listened, and I've also read some of those references. And I think there's a lot of false equivalence, or even false polyvalence, as you put it. That one, in those contexts, so let's take Australia. Let's take Austria, because some parts of Austria have compulsory voting.
Belgium and Brazil.
Yeah, and Belgium and Brazil. In fact, I'll come to Brazil, because I won't put Brazil in the category of those who have successfully implemented this. Because Australia and co, yes, they impose fines. But you need to look at a few factors. That there's a certain level, there's a certain place you need to get to as a society before you start compelling, those forms of participation. The level of political education and literacy, the institutions of states that exist to guarantee, accountability are in place, and fairness are in place in those countries. So you cannot draw that correlation with our own context. When you look at Egypt and Brazil, in fact, one thing is that these countries have been unable to enforce, compulsory voting. Worse still is that compulsory voting has been used by authoritarians in those regimes to oppress the people. And so we can't, when we're looking at these examples, we need to be very careful how we make references, because context matters. Context is completely different. And we think that in our own climb, what we actually require are some of the proposals that are before the National Assembly, and not this. And there's that thing about, the persuasive effect that political engagement does. Yeah, it's about people working freely and participating freely. And so that Australia does it does not mean that Nigeria, should do it. Let's address the foundational issues first, and then before we start thinking about, these kinds of draconian bills.
Well said. I think that one other challenge that has held us down is the inability to prosecute electoral offenders. And the National Assembly, that the bill about electoral offences, setting up electoral, has been in the limbo for more than, virtually in almost all the legislative periods that we have had. That bill has continued to surface, and then it doesn't go through. What can we do? Take the policy moment that we have to push for the creation of that commission.
I think first is the fact that if you don't have statesmen and stateswomen who are committed to democracy and committed to building this country, you're never going to have the kind of reforms that you desire. That our leaders need to come to a point where they put self-interest, and relegate their self-interest and prioritize our collective interest. Until that happens, you're not going to get an Electoral Offences Commission. Because what happens, Grand Convener, you know very well that the people who are supposed to make these laws are the real problems that we have. You want the same people who falsify, who present false documents to INEC at elections. You want the same people, because we've seen how the courts in recent times, has nullified and disqualified these same people for presenting false and forged documents. You want them to amend a law and create an institution that will prosecute them. You want these same politicians, because the same people who are making these laws are the same people who manipulate and rig our electoral process. They are the same people.
They subvert the process.
They are the same. And then they are now the ones who pretending over a legislative process.
So what are we going to do? Because
that's why I say if you don't have.
So how do we have?
The best way to do that is these forms of political education and mobilization. That there has to be consequence, whether moral or legal. And that's why raising public consciousness around these issues, but helping citizens understand the power that they have to ask these questions. It's important. And I think that this is what this radio program seeks to do.
Yes.
Putting getting citizens to recognize the power that they have. That one, you can engage your lawmaker regardless of where they stand on this particular issue, even if it's to demand that they convey to you where they stand on this issue and to ask them to push that this bill actually passes. The other thing is working with those institutions, because when you think about the Electoral Offences Commission, it passed in the last assembly. The Senate passed it. The House didn't pass it. When the House came, it started its own process ab initio. And so there is that, ping pong being played by the National Assembly. And we already know why they're actually doing this. But we need to put pressure on them and make them see the reason why this is important. And if there are any 5 bills, that this National Assembly should pass, as to consider as its legacy, is to pass the Electoral Offences Commission bill. This is 17 years since that proposal was made, including the draft bill which the Justice Uwais Committee presented to the National Assembly. After 17 years, we are still here talking about the Electoral Offences Commission.
But how is it that sunshine bills in the National Assembly are the ones that drag the most? It took forever to pass the Freedom of Information bill. It took 12 years. This is taking 17 years. But what I'm, surprised about is that we say politicians, but it is a politician that is promoting that bill in the National Assembly. Yeah, but it's honorable our friend Adebayo, Honorable Adebayo Balogun, who is promoting this Electoral Offences bill right now.
Absolutely.
So what is it that he's not, or that is not doing wrong? Where can we borrow muscle to be able to push through? I know you've identified raising public consciousness, but is there much more that we can do? Can boots be put on the ground to be able to? Because that's what happened with Not Too Young to Run, for which you were, at the center of. That is what happened with the Freedom of Information bill. Is there some liturgy on our part not to be able to push this through this time around?
Well, I don't think so. In fact, this is also one bill. When the proposal from bundling INEC was mooted 17 years ago, there was resistance on the part of INEC, to unbundle itself because they didn't want to share much of its powers. But this INEC has also recognized that it is so burdensome to get involved in the prosecution of electoral offences. And I've advocated for Electoral Offences Commission. I think there is consensus. In terms of consensus on this particular issue, there is consensus. The big question is, even though, yes, we have a bill, but are there lawmakers in the National Assembly that will prioritize this bill and say, we must pass this bill in this assembly? That's why we have to lobby, we have to engage, and we should put the pressure on members of the National Assembly. Of course, there are progressive ones who want this to pass. But if this also passes, the president also needs to assent to this. So whilst we're focused on the National Assembly, we also need to engage.
It's a two-pronged.
To engage the executive to see Electoral Offences Commission bill as a legacy bill, and that this bill is too important to be ignored, and that advocacy needs to continue, because only then can you have, accountability for the level of impunity that you see within our polity.
So I know that you have some experience with being in the board of some very important international election organizations. How do I put it now? Let's say, would you want to make a suggestion on appointment funding mechanisms for the EOC, and so that it cannot be captured by political interest? Because the way we're going, we might get it passed. When we then get it passed, the challenge is that I've seen us bring beautiful ideas and the politicians just take it and do what they like. What clear mechanisms of funding and control appointments that can insulate a very important commission like the one we're talking about from political interests?
So let me tell you our experience. In the last assembly, the Senate passed this. Yiaga Africa supported the Senate Committee on INEC. Passed this, did public hearings around this. The Senate passed its own version of the bill. One of the challenge with that particular bill under Malami was that somewhere in that particular bill, they inserted a provision that the rules and the guidelines of the Electoral Offences Commission shall be subject to the approval and control of the Attorney General of the Federation. And we thought that was very, very problematic, right? And then there were certain categories of offenses, that they introduced, and the penalties were not stiff, were not stringent enough to deter, deviant political behavior. They concluded on that, passed it. The Senate passed it. The House, knowing the politics in the National Assembly, when interest aligns, they are quick to adopting a legislation passed in one of the assemblies. But when interest diverges, you will hear different chambers saying different things, advancing different positions on the bill. The House decided to commence its own process. And what happened? That assembly under Femi Gbajabiamila ended. Now we are back here. A new bill has come. The discussion on this is only in the House, like you've referenced, Honorable Balogun. The question is, if the House goes through with its own bill, what will happen at the Senate? As we're having these discussions, let's keep in mind that we are almost 638 days to the 2027 elections. In other words, we have up until now, till the end of this year, to conclude on all electoral amendments, because by Q1 next year, by early next year, party primaries are due to commence.
Yes,
so if you don't pass this bill this year, we might as well just forget it to the next assembly. So these are the issues, and there has to be that fierce urgency of now, and hoping that with this radio program, both stakeholders will understand that this is too important and it should feature as one of the major bills that this National Assembly will pass.
It's still Electoral Reform Hour, and you can be part of this live program by sharing your comments via the social media platform on X at PAACA.ng with the hashtag Electoral Reform Hour, and you can leave your questions and comments for us on Facebook via at PAACA and our WhatsApp number 0816 8083 The phone lines will be open soon. Don't go anywhere.
Stay tuned to Electoral Reform Hour on the network. network service of Radio Nigeria. We'll be back shortly.
Are you ready for change? Join Peering Advocacy and Advancement Center in Africa, PAACA, every Thursday from 10 to 11 a.m. on the network service of Radio Nigeria for the Electoral Reform Hour. This program will amplify electoral reform campaigns and provide citizens with opportunity to make meaningful contributions that will strengthen our electoral process.
If you get the presidential election in place and National Assembly in place, and something happens to the governorship and the state assembly, there will be a president in place, there will be National Assembly in place. They can play a key role in making sure that the gap does not affect our constitutional stability. So I think that the way we are going is much, much better, and we should stick to it. It has worked for us and it's working for us, and there's no need to change what is working as of today.
Part of the things we used to grapple with then was the issue of ballot box snatching. You also would grapple with the issue of using police officers to even snatch the ballot boxes, the police officers that go with the politicians to the polling units. Over time, we saw that some of those issues that were identified, there were steps being taken to address them.
I think for INEC to build the confidence of citizens in whatever technology it's deploying, it doesn't really need to wait until there is an official complaint.
The electoral process, if we don't have women engaging or being represented, it means that our electoral process is not democratic, because democracy in itself is about inclusion and is about representation.
Let's embark on this path to significant transformation and well-informed decision-making together. As the National Assembly, INEC and other stakeholders work toward improving our electoral process, you too can be a part of the decision-making process by participating in the radio program.
You are on to Comrade Abdullah Mohammed, aka Aluta Osmis. I'm calling for Bida Local Government Area Council of Lagos State. I want to ask if a non-INEC staff is found with EC8, that is INEC original result, filled before the conduct of election, what will be the penalty of such non-INEC official?
My name is Mr. Zion. I'm calling you from Bayelsa State. When it comes to elections in this part of the world, we are not sincere to ourselves. We are so hypocritical and we are so criminally minded. You don't see the sincerity in us. You don't see the patrioticity in us. If Big Brother Nigeria can conduct election electronically to get their winner, how come Nigeria as a country, we cannot achieve the same results? Let us go back to the normal form, where you come with your paper, the community is here, they can see my face, they can see my picture, you tick me, I go straight to the voting system. Let us learn to save the money we don't have in this country.
My name is Isaiah, calling from Abuja. The other day, we were looking at the website of the current political party that is leading in the country, and then we found out that on the part that puts their vision and mission, there is nothing pertaining to a particular vision that holds the party together. And then it's beginning to look like in our political party system that most political parties are just a conduit fight for leadership positions, which is not what we see in other clients in other countries. I would like to hear what the guests in the house really have to say about this.
Remember, democracy is for the people. Let your voice be heard. This message is brought to you with support from MacArthur Foundation. PAACA, making democracy work for the people.
Thanks for staying tuned. We are back with your favorite program, Electoral Reform Hour, on the network service of Radio Nigeria.
Welcome back. You are still tuned into the Electoral Reform Hour on the network service of Radio Nigeria. Before the break, we began our conversation on comprehensive electoral reforms in Nigeria. Let's pick things up with our guest, Samson Itodo. Sam, currently the INEC chairman is a presidential appointee with Senate confirmation. Will transferring that power from the president to a broad-based selection committee as being proposed better insulate the office from partisan influence? How might such change affect public trust in INEC?
I think there are three things. First, in elections, and you know this better than I do, that sometimes perception influences acceptability of outcomes, and there's that duty that is placed on actors to ensure that whatever systems are in place does not create any perception of control.
What we have control perception. How do you control perception?
The way to control perception is transparency. There are certain principles. If you are open and transparent as an institution about your processes, it will build public perception and it will build trust, because you will be seen as an institution that is open. If you are consistent, and consistency is critical, because consistency creates, stability in the way people perceive an institution. Because when you deviate from a certain consistent pattern, questions are being raised, even if they are driven by factors that are not within your control. And then when you come to our own climb, you have a situation where often the appointing authority, who in this case is the president, is always referred to as a leader of a political party. And being a leader of a political party, appointing an umpire, especially in a context where we still find it difficult to delineate, so make a distinction between when we have a state responsibility that should be devoid of any partisan considerations vis-a-vis when we are acting as either members of our political party. That distinction needs to be created, and that is why the Ways Committee in their wisdom thought that to create a perception an impression that this entire process is devoid of politics, is important to divest that power. Secondly, we've seen how appointments have been used as an instrument of control. It is right before us, and General Convener, you were part of this advocacy, where we have seen presidents appoint people who have clear partisan leanings into INEC. They do so simply because they have the power to do that. We were here. Former President Buhari actually appointed his aide, who was notorious, for campaigning, for his party, as a national commissioner in INEC. We've seen even resident electoral commissioners who have certain, affiliations, and we all spoke about this. The reason why that can happen is because the power is with the president. Today, in today's INEC, you can see how there have been distortions in the tenure of some of the commissioners, which has adverse effect, in the way INEC operates. The current INEC chairman will leave in December. Now,
Five national commissioners will leave on the eve of the 20th.
Why did that happen? It wasn't the case. It happened because former President Buhari delayed appointments of these persons into the commission. In fact, this current chairman, if you recall very well, it was because there was going to be a constitutional crisis and INEC was not going to constitute a quorum. It was then that this chairman was then appointed because the president delayed. All of these experiences are some of the reasons underpinning why the power needs to be divested from the president.
To where?
Now, before we even say to where, there are also other issues about competence and capacity and the skill sets that are required for appointment into INEC. The Constitution provides non-partisanship and unquestionable integrity. Those criteria are insufficient in today's world. You need diverse set of skills in the commission, whether they are legal or communications or logistics or even estate or the range of capacities, skill sets that are required. So you need to also introduce that as part of this reform process. And then the issue about timelines. 30 days Wednesday after a vacancy, an appointment should be made into INEC. To your question about where should it be vested, Justice Uwais recommended that the NJC should become the body that would manage the appointment process. That was 17 years ago. Will Nigerians trust an NJC of 2025?
No, it's not. It's even beyond trust. You are a lawyer. Can a commission oversee another commission?
Absolutely. What is it? Even though it's a council led by the CJN, but we know that in reality the CJN determines virtually most of the members of the National Judicial Council. So my opinion is that the recommendation of Justice Uwais needs some review. I understand it was borrowed from South Africa, because as we speak, 3 vacancies have been declared in the South Africa Electoral Commission. They have called for applications because it's a job. People apply. It's the same thing that happens in Kenya, although for Kenya, there's a selection committee constituted by the Parliament of Kenya that conducts, the screening. And that's why we're saying you need to integrate a multi-stakeholder enterprise. You either have both the National Assembly and the NJC play a role, and then you need to have other stakeholders represented in that selection committee. People should apply. The interviews should be in a public space, and then you should have a public petitions process that is thorough. Not the one where, if you recall, we submitted petitions to the National Assembly over some appointments that the former president made. What happened to those petitions? A lot of them, were thrown out, not because they lacked merit.
We didn't come by way of affidavit.
But they say we didn't come by way of affidavit. And that is nowhere in the books that we needed to accompany a sworn affidavit to that petition. So this whole process requires a review, and we need to look at it. Unfortunately, we don't see, both the National Assembly and even the key actors prioritizing this discussion about the appointment, the mode of appointment for INEC chairman and the commissioners.
I want to see if our phone lines will cooperate this morning. If you can join the conversation by calling 091 50910 482. 091-50-910-483. You can also leave your questions and comments for us on WhatsApp on 0816-8083-424 and on X at PAACA.ngcap and Facebook at PAACA. Sorry, I don't know if we having any calls, not yet. So let's go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted your distance, but let me just chip in immediately. INEC is also now asking that they be allowed to appoint resident electoral commissioners,
state
directors rather than president. In your view, how will this shift influence state representation, political balance, and public confidence in election administration?
Quite frankly, I'm quite impressed that INEC is actually advancing this proposal, because what we've seen from previous INEC is they don't feel that making this demand is puts the commission in a good light. It would be as though it is challenging the executive. So it's good to see that INEC is actually now on the table, the advocacy room around this issue. I think that, yes, it's a brilliant proposal. We need to look at it carefully and also ensure that, the concerns that stakeholders have with respect to what's going to be the qualification for those who will be appointed in those states, what will be the disciplinary measures taken, because I think part of what INEC is requesting is you cannot have this current arrangement where the INEC leadership cannot discipline resident electoral commissioners. And we always make this example. Yes, the president appoints the IG of police. Does the president appoint the commissioners of police? The answer is no. He doesn't appoint the commissioners of police. So why should they be appointing the resident electoral commissioners?
Good morning. This is Electoral Reform Hour on the network service of Radio Nigeria. Can I meet you, please?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning to you.
My name is Abdullah Mustafa Mamajabi, calling from Bida.
Abdullah Mustafa, good to have you this morning. Make your comments and contributions. Hello? Okay, it's off. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so if the commissioners are appointed, by the IG of police, I think the same thing should also go for INEC. That way, you also insulate the commission, from incursions on its independence, and the commission can now discipline its own staff, who for either dereliction of duty or complicity and also compromise of the electoral process.
My experience is that elections are as good as the resident electoral commissioners you have in the states. Hello, good morning.
My name is Abdullah Mustafa Mamajabi, calling from Bida.
Abdullah, good to have you back.
I think electoral reform is a necessary step, a fundamental step to correct electoral issues in Nigeria. I think this program has come a better time, and we appreciate the guest. He has addressed almost everything. My contribution will focus on our politicians. He did mention about some of our politicians who are saddled with the responsibility of amending electoral act. They have problems. They have the problem. So how would they correct the mistake? So on
I hope we'll have Mustafa call us back. So yes, please continue.
Yeah, so you were making the point.
No, I said our elections as the resident electoral commission. That's what our experience has been.
Absolutely, you cannot compare the last Edo elections with the Ondo elections.
Yes,
because the REC in Ondo was a former director of INEC, who has vast experience, with election administration. You clearly see that there was a stark difference. The REC in Edo did nothing but wrecked the election. Well, to a large extent, he did. So these are the fundamental issues that you need to have high quality individuals who have the competence, who have the skill set, who have the sort of integrity to manage the process. Only then can the vote actually count at the state level. Because when you have a REC who has no modicum of respect for electoral stakeholders to have meetings with stakeholders, when you have a REC who is unable, to share information with stakeholders, when you have a REC that substitutes trained collation officers or supervising officers or POs, as the case may be, all you simply have is a charade.
That's true. So the big, I have you today, and I'm very excited because it's very difficult to have you. So I'm loading. If you notice, I'm packing.
No, it's not difficult to have me, but
I'm packing so much into the program. I know there are proposals around political party registration oversight from INEC to Independent Political Parties Regulatory Commission. What benefits would this bring? Are there risks to guard against? And then would also, because of time, I want you to talk about this single day conversation that is going on, having all elections in single day. All of that is being put into the amendments and reforms that are going on. Yes, what are your thoughts on?
To the best of my knowledge, and to begin with the single-day elections, I don't think this National Assembly is going to pass that particular proposal because amongst the range of issues in terms of the priorities, as you're aware, we're part of the technical committee. It's not featuring. I think they've jettisoned this. But I can give you my personal stand on this. First is, I believe that as a country, we can have elections in one day. And when we have elections in one day, what it will do, it will save us a lot of cost. Now, people make references to other countries. Most countries that I know in Africa have elections in one day. Most countries have elections in one day, and they have, in some cases, they even have 5-6 elections at the same time. Because what it does is, it reduces the cost that you spend whether on personnel or even on materials. Secondly, it also limits the bandwagon effect. Now, people who are opposed to it are saying, no, it's too much. It will lead to invalid votes, that giving people 5 ballot papers. And I say it only takes voter sensitization and mobilization. But if you have elections it is possible to have elections in one day in Nigeria, regardless of our context. But others have also advocated that you devolve the elections and make them zonal, and you can stagger the elections. And when you stagger elections in this climate, we know what it does in certain cases, because you have politicians who are not willing to play by the rules. And this is the challenge. And I made the point earlier, that we can do anything as a country. Our imagination, can go beyond limits. There's nothing that we cannot do. The only drawback that we have is whether our politicians will not see new innovations as entry points for subverting the process. Because anything can be done. And that's the thing about trust. If you look at, and in the 80s, there were times when presiding of ad hoc officials will hold ballot papers and result sheets and take it to their homes and bring them on the day of elections to cast their vote. The stakes, even though they were high, but we had people who were willing to play by the rules. There were some people who exhibited deviant behavior. Yes. Yeah. But then there was national consensus. But in today's Nigeria, the quality, the security features on our ballot papers is even higher than the security features in the currencies of most countries in the world, just because of the nature of the political class. I think somebody is trying to reach us. Good morning. Good morning. This is Electoral Reform Hour on Network Service of Radio Night. Hello.
Legislation, I think that is not necessary this time around. What we need to do, we need to amend Constitution. Credibility of election, INEC should be in power. It should be.
Is this Mustafa?
INEC should be off. INEC should be given power to regulate and control election without interference from the executive or legislature. After their independence should have direct power from the Nigerian Constitution. So issue of compulsory voting shouldn't come around, because rigging, masses will come out, electors will come out and line up in the sun, and at the end of the day, their election didn't count. Election must count. That is the law they need to make. Election must count. That is the law we need this time around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Elections are counting already, and it's important to emphasize that point. It's already counting. Citizens should have confidence that elections are counting. Go ahead, Sam.
No, so that's my sort of personal take.
Okay,
that the thing about
single. What about the political party registration?
But for political party registration, again, Justice Uwais recommended this because INEC has dual functions. It is, first
is the registrar and regulator of political parties.
And should the commission not be stripped of that responsibility to focus on just organizing elections? And that's the sort of proposal. I have seen the bill, which was also sponsored by the Speaker, because it deals with the question of funding of political parties. It also deals with the question of the constitution of, the registrar to register political parties, things about mergers. I think it's a comprehensive political parties bill. However, the point about, the sort of registration and regulation of political parties require deeper reflection to ensure that you do not create, an institution that now becomes a threat to the right of association.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Ezenwa. This is Avoka Musa calling from Bida, Niger State.
Abu, good morning. This is nice having you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to your guest for his wonderful analysis.
Samson Itodo, Executive Director of Yiaga Africa.
For his spirit of statesmanship, he has virtually touched all the areas I think I wanted to ask questions. So my calling is just to commend his efforts. I think we need to apply, our politicians need to apply the spirit of statesmanship in the election. So the election should not be do or die affairs. Election should not be for parties, for power, but for good governance and democratic dividends. If you look at it, the way we are having it today in Nigeria, politicians, the voter party is deteriorating. And all the result of all this is a result of poor conduct of elections. Appointing people who are partisans to take care of INEC offices, I think is uncalled for, which the past presidents have done. I commend President Goodluck Jonathan for appointing people who are not partisans. I hope our present president and other politicians will learn from President Goodluck Jonathan. Thank you very much for your wonderful analysis, sir. I hope you come back again and discuss more issues again so that we have a good election in Nigeria.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate your call. So, what are your thoughts on Regent's suggestions to mandate electronic transmission of polling unit results? Do you believe there should also be a pull for full electronic collation? This is where I'm really interested. How might this change affect transparency and trust in our elections?
I think I've said this earlier about electronic transmission of results. And first, we need to be clear about the distinction between manual processes and electronic processes. That distinction needs to be made. And I want us to note that we cannot surrender our elections to machines, because machines also fail. They have their vulnerabilities. The same way humans fail, because the clamor, for electronic transmission is derived from the fact that you will have cases where compromised individuals have manipulated results. So if you have human error, if you have human manipulation and tech-enabled manipulation, what it tells you, and everyone needs to know, that no system is free from manipulation. The best you can do is to ensure that there is oversight so it is not used. So we need electronic transmission of results and electronic collation of results. But it should not be the only. It should complement the manual process. The manual process we have as at today needs to be maintained. If you want to change the manual process, then maybe eliminate the ward collation level so that from the polling unit, it goes straight to the local government, because the infrastructure that is often needed at the ward level, things like lights, well-equipped schools, which again, raises the point that when we think about elections, we should know elections happen within a context. If you don't have good schools, it will
your
undermine.
election can never be better than your infrastructure.
Exactly. You undermine the integrity of the process. This is why governors at the state need to prioritize investment in education. So don't substitute the manual process with the electronic process. And anyone who is making that proposal that we should only maintain electronic transmission of results and collation, please, I beg that we shift grounds. We should have manual and the electronic go hand in hand so they can serve as a check on each other.
When you have a guest like Samson Itodo, the time runs very, very fast. Very special thanks, Sam Itodo, Executive Director of Yiaga Africa, for joining us on the program today. To our dear listener, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Electoral Reform Hour, brought to you by Peering Advocacy and Advancement Center in Africa with support from MacArthur Foundation. Our engineers today are Christy, Ankeli, and Hassan Usman. And ICT personnel are Oluwadamilola, Akinpelu, and Anne Okele. Studio manager has been Finehas Udueyo, and producer is Ando Embaohin and Joy Ubi. Supervisor is Huseina Akela MNI, and Grace Abu, Jeremiah Mkume, my facilitating crew members. After this program, you have any questions, you can reach out via text or WhatsApp on 0816-8083-424. We especially appreciate the contributions of our funders, MacArthur Foundation. The conversation continues next week, Thursday, same time, same station. Bye for now.